She's there's more information on her, much more information on the website, and also you can go to her website, which is elizabethrosner.com. Her most recent book, also her first book of nonfiction, it relates to what we're talking about today. It's The Survivor Cafe, The Legacy of Trauma and the Labyrinth of Memory. And it has been featured on NPR and also in the New York Times. And it's the one that most relates to what we're talking about today. I just finished reading it. It's educational, it's thought-provoking, it's very compelling reading. The writing is excellent. So the topic today is writing on trauma, and I'm just going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, everybody. It's so good to see all of your faces. Some of you I remember, certainly Maureen, and I think I heard Tony's voice in the background there. Hi. Oh, so good to see you both. And a whole part of my heart is in Mendocino with all of you. So thank you for inviting me to speak to you. And I guess people are going to continue to come in. So I trust that I don't have to worry about that. I'll just do my thing. I want to start by saying that it's complicated to be in a position of semi-authority on the subject of trauma. I have vivid memories of conversations with my editor at the time that we were putting together the structure of the book and talking about the content and kicking around subtitles. The title was always going to be Survivor Cafe, and I'll explain why, for those of you that haven't read the book, why that title is the title. But the subtitle took a while for us to agree on, and when I finally came to the realization that I wanted to include the word trauma in the subtitle, it was with some trepidation because, believe it or not, in 2016 and 2017, right before the book was scheduled to come out, it felt a little risky to put the word trauma on the cover of a book because it seemed possible that some people would be put off by it. And that even though I knew that the book really did contain a tremendous amount of contemplation, reflection, research about trauma, I worried that some people, even if they were interested in it, might feel like, well, don't take me down that road. I've had enough trauma internally. I don't need to go diving into it for the length of a book. And yet, of course, as is probably really evident to everybody at this point, I think not a day goes by, and now maybe not even an hour goes by, that we don't hear someone referencing trauma in the news, the weather practically. I mean, it's just ubiquitous. And so I think it wasn't that I was being prescient about writing about trauma, but that I think it has become almost overused at this point. And so I wanted to start by saying that because I feel like here you all are, you showed up because you weren't intimidated by the word, or you wanted to step into this conversation. And yet I think that it's really important to acknowledge that we don't all mean the same thing when we use that word. And maybe that goes without saying, but I feel the need to say that out loud, both for myself, really, to hear myself say it, and to say it to you, because I feel sometimes that our current vocabulary around trauma forgets or overlooks the idea that really it is a relatively recent ingredient in our discussion of our psychological makeup and the way we react to experience. And believe it or not, as recently as the 1980s, which now already really actually is quite a long time ago, but feels recent to me, in the 1980s, people were still uncomfortable referencing the concept of post-traumatic stress and saying that they weren't sure it was a real thing. There was still a lot of debate and disagreement about whether such a thing existed. And I think it's hard to remember that now because it seems like there's such complete agreement on it now. In the same way, in a similar way, the concept of epigenetics, which is what I write about, at least in part in Survivor Cafe, inherited modifications of the expression of DNA due to environmental causes such as trauma. The idea that trauma could be inherited currently is still under debate, even though maybe all of you here in this Zoom room, or certainly in my experience, think that, like PTSD, should go without saying is a real thing. That those of us who feel we are carrying the trauma, not only of our own experience, but experience that happened to our parents, grandparents, and as far back as you want to calculate, those of us that feel we are carrying that feel like science is only now catching up with the evidence for this, with the evidence to support that we aren't just imagining this legacy in us, in our bodies, in our psyches, in our material that we write about. And so as writers, there is both a choice to do this and then a certain kind of not choosing, that it is simply, in my case, for example, inherited trauma was in my family vocabulary, whether we use that word or not. And to be honest, we didn't use that word. So I'll just tell you a brief anecdote. When the book came out, when Survivor Cafe came out in the fall of 2017, and I was interviewed by National Public Radio for All Things Considered, my father, who features prominently in the book, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother died over 20 years ago. My father, thankfully, is still with us. I'm actually in his house right now in upstate New York. My father's endocrinologist heard the radio interview with me, and my dad called and said, "My endocrinologist heard you on the radio." And then he said, "Let me ask you a question. Do you think I was traumatized?" And my father was a 16-year-old at the liberation of the concentration camp of Buchenwald, where he had been a prisoner for a year. He was in an orphanage. The extent of his trauma, no one would disagree that my father was traumatized. But my father, at the age of, this was now when he was 80 something, late 80s, asked me, "Do you think I was traumatized?" And I hardly knew how to respond. And what I said was, "Well, what do you think, Dad?" And he said, and I quote, "Well, I don't know. I guess I never really thought about it before." You can say that that's generational, but you can also argue, and I think pretty compellingly, that part of his lifelong coping strategy with that trauma was to not name it as trauma and to not reckon with it as if it were something he had to face. It was just, he lived, he got through it, and then he got on with his life. And so the spectrum of responses to trauma, and now I'm, of course, talking about just people who have lived through traumatic events, is as broad as any of us can imagine, including how we write about it. So those of us who are here are saying, "I want to write about trauma, but how do I go about it?" I'm not here to deliver a set of formulas or a set of prescriptions. It's not what I do either as a teacher or as a writer, but I want to tell you some of the things that worked for me in case they might be helpful to you as tools, as strategies. So one thing that happened for me when I became a writer and realized that the material that I had been given as a daughter of Holocaust survivors was something that I could approach from a variety of angles, I first began writing about my family legacy in fictional form and through poetry. So I was deliberately choosing to take an oblique angle to the material. I was writing autobiographically, but I was modifying my family. I chose, for example, in my first novel, The Speed of Light, to make one of the parents in this family that I was writing about not a Holocaust survivor, even though both of my parents were, as a deliberate strategy from a writing point of view to say, I am not going to strictly abide by the facts of my own family of origin. That by making one parent a survivor and one parent not a survivor, I was really fundamentally altering the map of my family and therefore able to choose. I was writing primarily about the offspring of this set of parents, a brother and a sister. And in my mind, this brother and sister responded very differently to the legacy of the father's trauma. The father was the one who was the survivor in my novel. And that was my choice of saying, I want to understand how kids in a family don't turn out the same, even when they have the same parents, even when they have the same set of experiences and a lot of shared DNA. How is that possible? And so for me, I went at it by way of saying, well, if I alter the truth of these parents, alter away from my parents, then I'm going to be freer to use my imagination. And it will be a blending of fact and fiction. It will be a blending of my autobiography with a lot of what if questions. And so for fiction, for me, the way I approach not just traumatic material, but any material where I'm trying to go deeply into the psyche of my characters is to ask a lot of what if questions. So what if I, the part of me that moves the world in a way that feels frightened, that feels anxious, that feels like I have to have predictable guidelines, structures, formulas, plans, schedules, etc. What if that part of me were in operation 24/7? What kind of character would I be if that highly neurotic part of me were full-blown neurotic, scared, terrified of the world? And that character of Julian in The Speed of Light developed as somebody who was, a lot of people want to diagnose him agoraphobic, OCD. I don't like to diagnose him, but he lives in an apartment with 11 televisions and hardly goes out. And when he does go out, he only goes to precise locations, following the same routes every time. And I understand why people want to diagnose him. But his sister, on the other hand, also grew out of the part of me that is more extroverted and feels safe in the world and assumes that I'm capable of bringing joy and that I can sing when I want to. And she's an opera singer. And this feeling of taking the what if this were fully my personality and what if that also enabled me to tap into the scared parts of each of those characters to the point where I would ask, almost conducting interviews of these characters, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? What else are you afraid of? And alongside of that, what do you want? What do you want? What do you really want? What are you afraid you want? What are you afraid of wanting? What do you want that makes you fearful? And I would kind of do a dance of interviews with these characters, trying to get to know them not only as parts of myself, but as fully dimensional selves of their own. So through fiction, I was exploring a traumatic history, not only in my family, but in a character that I encountered in an article in the New Yorker magazine, who was the sole survivor of the massacre of her village in El Salvador. And in that case, it was someone else's trauma that I was trying to write about. And so I needed a different set of strategies to feel like I was respecting someone else's story. So this wasn't someone I knew. This was someone I read about. She was a real person in the village of El Mozote in El Salvador. And in that case, I was trying to feel my way into what I imagined her experience was, but there were parts of her actual experience that I felt that I had no right to try to imagine. That her trauma was so severe that I didn't want to feel as though I was appropriating and borrowing and invading territory that I honestly didn't feel I had true access to emotionally. And I have to tell you that that was part of my whole childhood, of always measuring the distance between what I had experienced and what my parents had experienced. That there was a way I knew I could never, even though I felt like I had inherited their grief, inherited their sorrow, inherited their suffering, there was a distance that I always felt that I couldn't cross, that I didn't know what it was like, and that I didn't want to try to imagine and feel like that was being inappropriate of me. And I have to say, there are a lot of other writers out there. Every other day, there's a new Holocaust novel in which a writer is writing an imagined character in hiding, in a concentration camp, in, Anne Frank's diary, all of these writers who I actually go back and forth with, feeling uncomfortable in their willingness to enter that territory of someone else's trauma as if they really could know it. And yet, that's our job as writers, is to imagine our way in by way of empathy, by way of our mind's eye. And so for me, it's always that territory that I'm careful around. So with this third character in Speed of Light, I left out certain facts of her experience because, for example, the real woman listened to the sounds of her own children being murdered. And I felt, I'm not even a mother, and I felt like there's no way I'm going to be able to write about that and not feel as though I am disrespecting the truth of what really happened to that person. So I did not include that as a fact of my character's history. So I hope you're getting a feel for how I was doing that in a fictional context. I was both trying to enter deeply into characters by way of my own experience, but I was also really careful to check in with my integrity, let's say, emotional integrity. Do I feel like I have permission to go into that place that is someone else's nightmare, not really my own? So now fast forward a few more novels later, and I begin to write Survivor Cafe, and I'm writing nonfiction now. And I'll talk about poetry as well, but let me talk about Survivor Cafe for now. When I took a series of trips to Germany with my father over the course of many decades, we visited the site of the former concentration camp of Buchenwald, where, as you heard, he was in concentration camp when he was a teenager. Each of those trips had a completely distinct context. One was in 1983, one was in 1995, and one was in 2015. Historical context, what age I was, what age my father was, what the Germans were doing in terms of whether it was preserved or not, whether Germany was divided in 1983. So each of these trips had a very, very significant set of characteristics. And I wrote about them at the time, but I also vividly remembered those experiences. I had also all my life been writing about and researching other genocides, not just the Holocaust, but tragically, not comparable, each unique, but Rwanda, Cambodia, even the war in Vietnam as its own kind of form of atrocity and series of atrocities, are dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of these, the whole history of African Americans in the United States, the whole history of Native Americans in the United States, the Armenian genocide, all of these genocides that I, in my little brain, was trying to hold, decided that I wanted to write now about what wove all of these together somehow in both my psyche and my attempt to understand really what human beings are capable of at our best and at our worst. So in that case, I started really researching epigenetics, as I just told you, which was pretty rare as a term back in 2015, 2016, when I was writing this book. I don't know how many of you are already familiar with it now. It has become almost as ubiquitous as the word trauma. But epigenetics literally is defined as the way certain aspects of DNA are modified by environmental experiences like trauma. So, for example, your stress level hormones of cortisol are either highly elevated by a traumatic episode or event, or sometimes cortisol levels are just shut down. Your body doesn't produce it anymore. You become kind of numb to experience. And you know people like this, I'm sure, very kind of flat, nothing kind of gets them excited. They stay very neutral, almost to the point where it seems like they're muted. They're on mute. You know, we all know, are you muted on Zoom right now? But the other extreme of that is that their cortisol levels are just firing all the time. And one way of defining that form of what we often refer to as PTSD is the inability to feel safe in a safe environment. That your cortisol levels are just warning you all the time, fight, flight, or freeze, no matter what's going on. This is a very common response to trauma, this inability to differentiate, right? So if you were writing a fictional character, you would want to know that about the effect of PTSD on the psyche, either those extremes and of course everything in between, but those are common extreme responses to trauma. If you're writing about your own trauma, though, this is where we start to get into the memoir territory and also poetry, which is often very autobiographical. How do you manage your own stress levels, your own tendency to be re-traumatized when you revisit a traumatic history? Now, this is a question that nobody can answer for you. This is a question where ideally you have learned to tune in to your physiological clues and cues that you're being triggered or you're being overwhelmed or you're shutting down and you're going numb. And so as a writer, you notice how much you can tolerate of revisiting a traumatic history, of giving language to things that are sometimes so unspeakable. And again, with Holocaust survivors, we forget that in the first decade or so after the end of World War II, very few Holocaust survivors spoke aloud about what they had experienced, even to the people closest to them, for a variety of reasons, including that they didn't even think they would be believed, that some of what they were describing was so horrific and so seemingly impossible to comprehend that a lot of survivors just chose never to speak about it. Others knew that they couldn't tolerate speaking about it, and yet others felt like you wouldn't be able to tolerate the pain of what they told you. And certainly with children, that was often the case. Holocaust survivor parents wanted to protect their children from their experience. So with your own trauma or with the trauma of people closest to you, as a writer, how do you respect that kind of titration or that kind of patience sometimes? That recognition that sometimes it's too close, just chronologically, you're too close to the recency of an experience. There's no one who can tell you how many years have to go by before you can write about a trauma. There are people who do write about trauma almost while they're in it, and there are people who need to wait 50 years, 70 years, several generations. There's no right and wrong about that length of time you take. There's no predicting what it's going to feel like when you begin and then you realize it's too soon. I'm not ready. I have to set this aside. I can only do this when I'm in a really, really calm state. I have to meditate for an hour before I write. I have to make sure there are no loud noises near me or possible intrusions. I have to make sure, here's a key one, I have to make sure no one is going to read this until I've completely decided that I want to share this. And I can't emphasize enough when you're writing about your own trauma, No one, and I do say this very emphatically, no one is allowed to tell you that it's good for you to share it, that it's going to help you heal. You know, you have to know what your own healing strategies are and what is the safe way for you to share or never share your writing. And I honestly believe that that can change over time. If you say to yourself, I'm never going to share this, and then a year later you go, you know, this is the best thing I've ever written. It's the most authentic and true. And I love the fierceness of my voice and how brave I had to get. It's been a year. Maybe I want to revisit that question, even though I said a year ago I would never show it. Maybe I'm in a different place now. You know, I'm never going to show this to this X person, this Y person, you know, the person who was the perpetrator. I mean, you get to say all kinds of things to protect yourself, to build a safe container for this writing. And it is completely legitimate to give up on a project, you know, to just set something aside and say, I thought I could do it. I thought I was ready. I'm not. It's too scary. It's too painful. And sometimes you might even feel like, you know, it's not what I want to write about just because it's the hardest thing that ever happened to me, just because it's the most dramatic material I have. Nobody can tell you, well, if it's that scary, it means you have to write about it. I mean, you will hear some teachers say that. There are plenty of writing teachers out there instructing people, you got to go into the trauma, you got to dive right in, you got to dig down into it. And I don't agree with that. It's like there were wave after wave of therapy treatments, primal scream, there, you know, psychedelics, I mean, all sorts of things that really weren't safe for a lot of traumatized people. And I think a lot of people have experienced being re-traumatized by being told by an authority figure, a writing teacher or a therapist or someone saying, you know, you have to do it this way. This is the only way you're going to heal. I'm not a therapist. I can't give you therapeutic advice, but I can say as a writer and as somebody who's been working with this material for decades and teaching writing for decades, I really believe that you are your best teacher when it comes to knowing what your timing is, what your methods are. And it may be that even if somebody says, now's the time, you can say, now's not the time. It's not for someone else to tell you. That's my personal belief. And I stress that because I feel like sometimes we want someone to tell us when, or we want someone to push us. And yet you are the one to know what you can tolerate. You are the one to know, you know, I have to push back against this advice. It's not right for me. Maybe it's right for somebody else, but not for me. I'm wondering if I can just pause for some questions now. I have so much I can talk about. I can talk for hours about this subject. And I really certainly welcome you to, if you haven't read Survivor Cafe, to take a look at it. I did the audiobook. You can listen to me read to you for 9 hours and 14 minutes if you like to do books that way. But I think the point is, you know, that book does contain a lot of other information and material that about the study of trauma, the study of narrative responses to trauma, not just writing, but telling. And then the last thing I want to mention before taking questions is getting back to poetry for a moment. When I was about 2/3 of the way through writing Survivor Cafe, I started to feel that kind of overwhelm that I was telling you to watch out for, to notice. And one of the ways I felt overwhelmed was feeling like I didn't have enough language, that words were failing me. That like I said, the ubiquity of the word trauma, the ubiquity of the word survivor, for that matter, I started to realize that I just needed to write out what I ended up calling the alphabet of inadequate language, to just name all the words that I felt were never going to do justice to what I was trying to write about. And I really wrote that as a kind of purging, as a kind of exercise for myself. But it turned out that that was actually the map of the book, that it became what I called an alternative table of contents for the book. It shows up at the very beginning of the book. It's a map, it's a frontispiece, it's a table of contents. I call it all sorts of things, but it was really me being transparent about what I felt were my own genuine limitations. I think I have a great vocabulary. I'm very poetic and lyrical and all these things, but I really wanted to name from A to Z words that I felt would never really do justice to the complexity and depth of the material. So I want to mention that too as a strategy, sometimes to just write to yourself about how hard it is to do this, how inadequate you feel to your subject, how much it costs you to revisit this story, how much you don't want to write it, but you feel you do want to, that you can have these conversations with yourself on the page, and whether they find their way into the finished product really doesn't matter. It's the process itself of allowing the writing to be its own process. So I'm going to stop there and invite questions or comments. I don't know if you want to just raise your hand, or Susan, do you want to moderate? I don't know how you want to do that.
I'll let just people go ahead and unmute themselves and ask the question if they have a question.
So Elizabeth, I've started and stopped many times on a long piece about that is, trauma based, obviously. And so it's really good to hear you talk about how it has to be when you're ready to write about it. One of the things I ended up doing was I changed everybody's name, and I call it fictionalized memoir, because there is a lot of fiction in it. Obviously, I can't know what was in other people's heads. I only know how things affected me. But the other thing I found helped was I went back and I wrote back 2 generations. I went back 2 generations. I could go back even more and find more trauma, but I went back 2 generations and wrote the story of my grandparents and how they met. And I romanticized it, and it's part of the piece. But it helps tell the story of today, or of my life, of what happened to me as a child. And so anyway, that's what I did. And I just really appreciate you saying that it's all about you and when you're ready. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for talking about name changing, because one of the comments and questions I get most often as a writer, and even before I wrote this book of nonfiction, was how do you protect other people in your life from your revelations? And when do you decide that your story is your story and you have the right to tell it, and kind of, hell or high water, other people are going to have to put up with it. And I'm not even getting into the whole legality of things, and because I'm not a lawyer, and publishers address that on their own. They have entire legal teams for that. But I think that something as simple as changing names does a lot, not only to, as you say, to disidentify this person with this real person, but internally for you, as I think Michelle was just describing, it allows you to get more clear about, I'm not really trying to write them. I'm trying to write my version of what happened, in which they were a participant, but it's really more about me than it is about them. So maybe I'll just name them something else as a reminder to myself. I'm not really trying to get them right. I'm trying to get my own experience right. And I think that is a really important distinction. It may sound nuanced. It may sound like I'm kind of being superficial. Just changing a name can change something like that. But I think psychologically for us, it does. It creates a distance, and it creates a kind of new opening into remembering that we can only know our own version of the story, And honestly, and again, this is maybe a very overly simplistic way of saying, they get to write their version someday if they want to. They do. And of course, then there's the more humorous response from somebody like Anne Lamott, who says, if people didn't want you to write about them, they should have behaved better. That's one thing she says frequently. And the other thing she says is that half the time people don't recognize themselves, so you can just, the worry that we put ourselves through, there are ways we can alleviate that. And then there are other people who go all the way into the extreme of letting other people who are included in the narrative read and let them know, are you okay with this? Are you comfortable with this? And those are special circumstances. I don't recommend that to just blanket everyone in your experience. Make sure everyone gives you the sign off on your work. First of all, it will take your whole life for them to read it. But who talks a lot about this is a writer named Laura Davis. And she, along with Ellen Bass, co-wrote The Courage to Heal, which is 30 years old now, maybe older. I think it came out in the 90s. The Courage to Heal, which was a lot about sexual trauma, really all about sexual abuse, sexual trauma. And she has a new book coming out now about reconciliation with her mother, who completely denied Laura's accusation against her grandfather that he had molested her over a period of many, many years. And so her relationship with her mother completely broke down. And Laura Davis talks about giving her manuscript to her mother and to her siblings to see if they felt okay with what she had written. And that to me is mind-blowing. I just find, and she chose to do it for a whole set of reasons that she talks about. She blogs about this a lot. And the new book is called The Burning Light of Two Stars. It's coming out in November. And I did an interview with her that's going to be in the Los Angeles Review of Books. But Laura Davis is somebody you can look up. You can get onto her mailing list, and she writes so much about, how to handle difficult material in a family, especially with the subject of sexual trauma, sexual abuse, and what happens when family members deny it, and the shattering of those relationships and reconciliation. So she's somebody to check out for sure. Other questions? Susan, you're muted. You're still muted. Yeah. I wonder if someone can unmute Susan. Maybe someone who knows what Susan wanted to ask. Huh. I don't know why that is.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. I was just going to ask if there were other questions, that's all. But I was getting a message that the host was not allowing people to unmute. So I don't know, Doug. Just raise your hand if you have a question. It sounds like everything's okay.
And you can also write your question into the chat if you want.
And I will read them to you if that happens, yes.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if Doug is hosting, maybe he muted everybody and then had to volunteer.
I double checked it and everybody can unmute themselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Doug. Well, I'm curious, I am curious how you decided to go from writing about it in terms of fiction to nonfiction. Was that always the plan and you waited until you were ready, or?
It was not always the plan. Each time I wrote a novel, so my first novel is The Speed of Light, which officially 20 years ago, anniversary, it came out 20 years ago. That book took me 10 years to write, and I wrote it at a time 20 years ago when people were not talking really about inherited trauma in the way they are now. And so I didn't even use that language. It was just what it was about. And it was also about the healing power of storytelling. And it was translated into 9 languages. It got optioned for a film. It won a number of prizes. I mean, and my book tour was supposed to start on 9/11. The nationwide book tour, first day was the morning of 9/11. So that was an experience. But having poured myself into that book, I thought, okay, I've written everything there is I can say about being a daughter in my family, but doing it in this fictional way. And then my second novel, Blue Nude, was actually delving into the German inheritance of trauma. And I wrote about a German painter and an Israeli model who comes to pose for a class he's teaching, and just how their history rises up the minute they hear each other's accents. And then they have to kind of work this out through a creative process, a creative collaboration. And again, after finishing that novel, I thought, okay, I've really done this now. I have really written about the Holocaust from both sides now. And then my third novel, Electric City, was set in the hometown of Schenectady, where I am right now, because I realized, oh, I've written about my childhood, you know, psychologically and emotionally, but geographically, I haven't written about where I grew up, the sense of place and the history of place. And so in my third novel, I was really writing about the layers of history a place can hold. There's tremendous Native American lineage in this town, and yet I never learned Native American history growing up. You know, my town its nickname was Electric City, which is the title for the novel, the home of GE, and everybody's dad worked for the same company, and it was a company town. And so in that novel, I did feel like, okay, I'm finally moving away from purely autobiographical Holocaust material. I'm getting into a bigger landscape of history, hundreds of years of history. And yet there's still a kind of a traumatic storyline running through that, how people heal over time from historical harm, historical damage, loss on a collective level. And by the time I was promoting Electric City, I was taking this trip to Germany with my father in 2015, and we attended an event near the site of the concentration camp that the Germans called Survivor Cafe. And they asked the returning camp survivors to sit at cafe tables and be open to conversation, informal, casual conversation with locals about their experience. And I thought, to put these two words together, the word survivor and the word cafe, I just found so startling that when I came back from that trip and spoke with my editor about it, he said, Liz, that's the title of your next book, and you're going to write a book of nonfiction now. It was really him saying it, because he knew that essentially these were the themes I'd been writing about all my life, but it was time now not to mediate it through fiction, not to mediate it through other characters, but to write about what I'd been thinking about my whole life and what I'd been trying to understand my whole life, and what I still wanted to know, what I still wanted to learn. And so I had no intention of writing nonfiction, except that I'd been writing short essays. But this book suddenly almost came out fully formed. It was the fastest book I wrote. It took 2 years, as opposed to 10 years for The Speed of Light, 6 years for Blue Nude, 8 years for Electric City. I'm the slowest writer in the world, in case you haven't noticed. And no, somebody's competing for that title. But this book, in many ways, I'd been writing already internally my whole life. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Susan, but and now I have to say, you didn't ask me this, but I am working on a new book of nonfiction that now I kind of feel a really deep love for nonfiction. And you know, I know this is being recorded. I feel like I want to whisper this little secret. Nonfiction is easier to write than fiction. It's so much easier. Fiction is really hard. for me, really hard. So there's something kind of wonderful about being in the mode of nonfiction now.
Other questions? I can. Yeah, Nona.
It looks like it says art, but yeah.
Yeah, it's Nona.
Nona, hi Nona. She's muted though.
You have to unmute Nona. Uh-oh,
Oh no, we can't hear you.
Are you muted?
I'm trying
Doug?
to, security says that everybody is unmuted. I'm trying to figure out a way to unmute everybody. Since I can't allow, it's saying that everybody could do their own, but that's not happening. So I don't know what to do exactly.
Nona, could you write your comment in the chat?
Yeah, that'll have to do it.
Oh, that's right. She's raising her hand. She can't because of
Oh,
the
one finger, come on.
Darn. This is too bad. I wonder if it has something to do with the way it's being recorded.
No,
Hmm.
sorry.
Okay,
doesn't-
sorry,
okay.
Nona.
Hey.
You know what? I want to say, and this is for everybody, not just for Nona. My email, elizabeth@elizabethrosner.com. Please feel free to send me a note if you have something you want to ask me that you weren't able to today. And also just to say, for those of you, I still teach writing classes. I work one-on-one with writers a lot. I'm around. You can find me. But Leslie wrote, can you elaborate about why nonfiction is easier to write than fiction? So I'll try to say what's true for me. Obviously, it's not true for everybody. You know, I think in retrospect, when I look back at my novels, I think on some level, the way I was describing to you my what if process and my what if I take this part of me and kind of, you know, extrapolate and say this part is my full-blown personality. I think that took a lot of psychic energy and a lot of imaginative energy, and then to move story forward and to make sure that all the plot pieces hang in balance, and that my interest in the depth of character is equal to my interest in storytelling and narrative movement and conflict resolution. And I think there's something about nonfiction that for me just feels more pure, like I can just think my way onto the page, and to trust that there is narrative embedded in that, but that I don't have to be sure to always be making a story work and making characters believably dimensional. And there's something more organic about it and more fluid for me. And I just don't know how else to explain it, Leslie, except to say that it feels more natural and it feels less effortful. And I'm not saying I won't write fiction again. I actually, there's an idea I've had for a novel for a while that I'm still sort of waiting for the right moment to resurrect that work. But there is something about the way my own brain functions and the way my mind works that I love kind of leapfrogging from idea to idea. And I love intuitive interconnections of subject matter. And I think that what I did in Survivor Cafe, people often call a hybrid of memoir and creative nonfiction, or memoir and scholarship or research. But I do feel like on some level that is the most natural form for me, even though I've loved writing poetry and I've loved writing novels too. And I'm not saying it's permanent, you know, this choice. It's for now. Yeah. I hope that answers your question though.
It does. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's insightful, because I'm writing currently something that is true, and I changed everybody's names and where they live, and the plot's already there because it's nonfiction. But this is good because it makes me think I don't have to change quite so much.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that, really we are living in a time when genre lines are getting blurrier and blurrier. And, 50 years ago, no, 70 years ago, when Zdena Berger, who lives at Sea Ranch and is a survivor of Auschwitz and other camps, wrote her gorgeous book, Tell Me Another Morning. She called it an autobiographical novel. She was way ahead of her time saying it that way. And what she chose to do was create some composite characters based on the real women that she went through 4 years of concentration camp existence with. They survived by helping each other. She said to me, I've interviewed her many times, she's a dear friend, that she could only write it the way she wanted to write it by calling it a novel, even though everything was true. And except for, as I said, the composite of characters, but it's beautiful. And I think she needed to give herself permission to write beautiful prose about the absolute worst events of her life or anyone's life. And so now people call things autobiographical novel, autofiction. I mean, we're still kind of trying to find language for these forms that don't have precisely defined boundaries around this is fact, this is not fact. It's just fascinating that nonfiction is called nonfiction, that it doesn't have a name of its own. Nonfiction is called this thing that isn't this other thing. I mean, so we really do struggle with what to call this stuff over and over again. I think we're almost out of time, or I'm almost out of time. Is there another quick question? Or Nona, did you want to try? Doug says you can unmute yourself now.
Actually, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good to see you again. I just wanted to put a plug in for Survivors Cafe because I thought it was really compelling reading to have people who weren't even born during the Holocaust come to understand it from people who lived through it. There was just so much empathy and shock and understanding and compassion that came from people who had lived through the Holocaust to these young people who were trying to get the horror of what went on. So I just wanted to put a plug in.
Thank you, Nona. Thank you. And I want to thank Chrissy out loud for your comment about Electric City. Thank you, Chrissy. I really do. I want to say that despite what I said about preferring to write nonfiction now, I still am able very humbly to say that I still am proud of my fiction and the work that I put into to write my novels, and that I do feel like the themes and messages and stories and images that run through all of my work really are all interconnected. And I'm not saying you should read all my work, but I do believe that there are a lot of threads and web-like connections in all of my fiction and poetry and nonfiction too. It's such a delight to be with all of you. I know that you guys want to talk amongst yourselves after I go. Please do check in with me through my website or whatever if you're interested. Oh, Fran, I see you there. Hi, Fran. Oh my gosh, it's so nice to see you folks. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Doug, for making this happen. Thank you, everybody, for just being present. I feel you. I see you. I appreciate you. My new book is about listening, deep listening. So you are giving me that gift today. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you. And those of you who do want to stay on and chit chat about whatever, feel free. We'll be here. But thank you very much.
Right.
And now I want to go back and see the process you went through by reading your books until you got to where you were in a place of nonfiction.
Say that is something worthwhile if you're inspired to do it, to see the trajectory and the movement through the material and how it revisits itself. I mean, there is a kind of full circle between The Speed of Light 20 years ago and Survivor Cafe now that I didn't intend, as you said, you know, did I intend this all along? And yet it's so evident to me now looking back. So thank you. And I want to thank you for recording this. And I'm assuming that you'll send me the recording when it's ready to share it as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Next time in Mendocino proper, I hope.
I hope so.